is accused of coercing 3 young men into relationships. Steve Osunsami has details of the lawsuit.
He was already buried. Off-white robe, gold cross resting on his chest, rings on his fingers, 6 hours of funeral, 4 former presidents had sat in his sanctuary. Deion Sanders wept at his pulpit and told the crowd that perhaps they had been wrong about this man. And then, months later, a federal document landed at the DeKalb County Courthouse. The Internal Revenue Service had filed a lien against the late bishop and his widow, Vanessa Long, for $335,216. The man who drove a Bentley, who built a $50 million cathedral, who received a $1 million federal grant from the White House, who preached that financial prosperity was God's direct blessing on the faithful. The IRS was at his widow's door before the year was out, and that federal lien, quiet, bureaucratic, filed in a county courthouse, turned out to be the most honest thing anyone had said about Bishop Eddie Long in decades. What he built, the real scale of it. To understand how the paper trail matters, you have to understand the scale of what Bishop Eddie Long constructed. He arrived at New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia in 1987. The congregation had roughly 300 members. Within a few years, it had grown to more than 8,000. By the peak of his ministry, New Birth claimed 25,000 members, sat on 240 acres, and operated out of a $50 million cathedral built to hold 10,000 worshipers in a single service. He held the funeral for Coretta Scott King in 2006. 4 American presidents sat in his sanctuary that day. His ministry received a $1 million federal grant under George W. Bush's faith-based initiative. He appeared on stages around the world. He told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in 2005 that New Birth was not just a church, but an intern, national corporation, and that he dealt with the White House, with Tony Blair, with presidents around the world. The prosperity gospel he preached, the theology that ties financial blessing directly to faith and generosity, came embodied in a man who wore gold chains over his collar, flashed a Rolex when he raised his hand to bless the offering, and drove a Bentley off the lot of his Lithonia mansion. He was not preaching about a distant God. He was presenting himself as the proof of the doctrine. That matters enormously when you understand what was happening behind the scenes. The Longfellows program, and what it actually was. Among the many programs Eddie Long launched at New Birth was one specifically designed for fatherless young men. He called it the Longfellows Youth Academy. He pulled in young men who had no fathers at home. He offered to be the daddy they had been praying for. He gave them something to belong to, and for many of them, the ones who were struggling, the ones who had grown up without male presence, without stability, without anyone who looked them in the eye and said, "I see you," that offer felt like the answer to a prayer. In September 2010, that program became the center of one of the most significant church abuse cases in American history. Maurice Robinson, 20 years old, Anthony Flagg, 21, Jamal Paris, 23, Spencer LeGrand, 22. They filed civil lawsuits in DeKalb County, and the language inside the complaints was specific and devastating. They alleged that Bishop Eddie Long used his position as a spiritual authority figure to coerce them into sexual relationships that began when they were teenagers. Jamal Paris said he was 14 years old when he first met the bishop, and that Long told him to call him daddy. Spencer LeGrand said he was 15 when they met in Charlotte after a sermon about fathers. Long looked at him and said, "I got you. I will be your dad." The ceremony. Nobody was supposed to talk about. What the young men described went further than abuse of authority. They described something that their attorney, B.J. Bernstein, characterized in plain language as a marriage ceremony. Candles were lit, jewelry was exchanged, scripture was read, vows were said while the candles burned down. The trips that followed read like a travel itinerary: Kenya, South Africa, Honduras, the Bahamas, Trinidad, New Zealand. Spencer LeGrand said that in a hotel room in Nairobi, Kenya, when he was 17 years old and jet-lagged and exhausted, the bishop urged him to take a sleep aid. What he described happening afterward was something he had not asked for and did not consent to. Bernstein released photographs. Bishop Eddie Long posing in what appeared to be a bathroom in a tight red muscle shirt. The image had been sent from his personal BlackBerry in November 2008, signed Eddie L. Long, amazed by his grace. Bernstein stood in front of cameras and asked a question that should never have needed asking. What pastor in his right mind sends a photograph of himself posing in his bathroom in a muscle shirt to a young man in his congregation? A fifth young man, Centino Kemp, never filed a lawsuit, but he joined the eventual settlement. He had Bishop Eddie Long's name tattooed on his wrist. 5 rocks, and not one was thrown. On September 26, 2010, Bishop Eddie Long stepped into his pulpit. 25,000 people were watching, the cameras were on, and he delivered a line that the internet has never forgotten. He said he felt like David facing Goliath. He said he had 5 rocks, and he said he had not thrown a single one yet. The sanctuary stood. The applause lasted. He never threw a single rock. By May 2011, he had reached a confidential settlement with all 5 young men. The financial terms were not publicly disclosed, though multiple outlets reported the figure was in the range of $15 million. His attorney stated that Long C. categorically denied the allegations. The settlement, as is typical in civil cases, did not constitute an admission of guilt. What the settlement bought was silence, and what that silence cost him, over the 6 years that followed, was something no amount of money could have anticipated: the paper trail behind the pulpit. Even before the lawsuits, investigative journalists at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution had been tracing a financial paper trail that told its own story about Bishop Eddie Long and New Birth. In 1997, the church gifted land to a charity called Bishop Eddie Long Ministries. In 1998, that charity used a mortgage of more than $1 million to purchase a property. Then, on Christmas Eve of 2003, in a transaction that should have raised serious concern, the property was transferred directly out of the charity and into Eddie Long's personal name. On the same day, a $300,000 loan was taken against it. 3 more mortgages followed. In 2006, the property was deeded back to the church. Eddie Long testified under oath at one point that Bishop Eddie Long Ministries was, essentially, Bishop Eddie Long. He said it in plain language. The charity and the man were the same thing. WSB-TV investigative reporter Jody Fleischer documented that the church paid roughly $200,000 in property taxes on the bishop's private residence, and nearly $85,000 on his private jet. Between 1997 and 2000, the charity provided Long with more than $3 million in salary, benefits, and property transfers. Senator Chuck Grassley opened a Senate Finance Committee investigation into 6 televangelists. Eddie Long was one of them. The Ponzi scheme that came from the pulpit. There is a separate chapter of this story that is just as damning as the lawsuits. Bishop Eddie Long stood in his pulpit and introduced a young man named Ephraim Taylor to his congregation. He called Taylor his friend, his brother, the great Ephraim Taylor. He told his members that everything Taylor said was grounded in the Word of God. He endorsed him as a man to be trusted with their money. There was an internal memo inside New Birth that warned the church leadership that Taylor intended to take advantage of members. The introduction happened anyway. More than a dozen church members subsequently lost over $1 million combined in what turned out to be a Ponzi scheme. They filed suit against Long, the church, and Taylor in DeKalb County. A class action followed. Ephraim Taylor was convicted of federal fraud charges and sentenced to 19 years and 7 months in federal prison in March 2015. Long reached a separate settlement in the investor lawsuit. Its financial terms were also not publicly disclosed. The vanishing, and what followed. Beginning around 2016, Bishop Eddie Long began to change visibly. A video surfaced showing him doing curls in a gym, and the man in the frame was not the man his congregation recognized. He was gaunt, hollow. The physical presence that had been central to his entire ministerial identity, the muscles, the tailored shirts, the sense of physical authority, was gone. He told his congregation he was on a raw, vegan diet. He said he had rejected what he called the slave menu. He said he was going to live to be 100 years old. The story changed. A church spokesman acknowledged a health challenge. By December 2016, Long was completely bald and visibly frail when he stood before his congregation. He told them he was not answering their calls because everyone wanted to ask questions, and he did not want to rehearse facts. Bishop Eddie Long died on January 15, 2017. He was 63 years old. The church issued a statement saying only that he had succumbed after a gallant private fight with an aggressive form of cancer. No further medical detail was ever released. His funeral lasted 6 hours. Deion Sanders wept at the microphone. Long was laid out in an off-white robe with a gold cross and rings on his fingers. His daughter wrote that she loved him and thanked him for being perfect. And within months, the IRS lien arrived. What the fortress left behind. The succession at New Birth collapsed almost as quickly as the doctrine. Bishop Stephen Davis took over after Long's death. He served without a salary for his entire tenure and personally contributed significant funds of his own to keep the church operational. He resigned after 16 months and stated publicly that corrupt leaders had forced him out. Edward Long, the bishop's own son from a first marriage that had been kept almost entirely hidden from his congregation, was passed over twice for the senior pastor position. The role eventually went to a Baltimore pastor named Jamal Harrison Bryant, who inherited a reported $31 million in church debt and promised the congregation a rebirth. The membership, which had once claimed 25,000, had shrunk to approximately 10,000 by the time of Long's death. The mansion on Hunt Valley Drive, the gated Georgia estate that journalists had spent years documenting and that Long had publicly deeded back to the church in 2006, was still standing. The Bentley was gone. The bishop was gone. And the IRS wanted $335,000 from his widow. What this story actually teaches. The story of Bishop Eddie Long is not ultimately about one man's failures. It is about a system that made those failures possible and kept them hidden for far longer than they should have been. A theology that presented wealth as God's endorsement. A charity structure that blurred the line between institutional funds and personal property. A program designed for vulnerable young men that allegedly became the mechanism for their abuse. A congregation large enough and loyal enough that dissenting voices could not gain traction. A culture where standing in the pulpit and saying "I have 5 rocks" was more persuasive than the documented accounts of 5 young men who said they had been harmed. The IRS lien was not the most significant document produced by this story. The most significant documents were the civil complaints filed in September 2010 by 4 young men who had the courage to walk into a lawyer's office and say what had happened to them. They were not believed by everyone. They were pressured, they settled under confidentiality agreements, and they spoke publicly anyway, because the money, as Spencer LeGrand said, did not buy happiness. When you go to sleep at night, the problems are still there. Jamal Paris looked into a television camera and said he could not get enough showers to get the smell of that man off his body. That testimony exists. It is documented. And it is the real inheritance of the empire Bishop Eddie Long built. That is the full documented account, from the prosperity gospel pulpit to the IRS lien, from the Longfellows program to the civil settlement, from the 5 Rock speech to what the paper trail actually showed. I want to know which part of this story you think the church needs to reckon with most honestly, not just New Birth, the broader church. The theology, the accountability structures, the way power concentrates around charismatic leaders. Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. This community handles difficult conversations with more care than most. If you are not subscribed, now is the time. Turn on notifications. We are covering accountability in religious institutions with sourced, documented reporting, and the stories we are following right now are some of the most significant in years. Thank you for watching. Stay discerning.